This is Amin, and we're joined by Michael, who is joining us today to help interview perhaps one of our longest fans, Professor and Dean David D. Perlmutter. Welcome, David. It's great to have you on here.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm saying hello from the campus of Texas Tech University, where, by the way, our greeting is guns up. So we're already ensconced in the Game of Thrones universe even before it began. So
we always have refreshments here, starting with a round of lemon cakes. But we weren't sure if you prefer. We have both Dornish wine and we have some wines from the Arbor. I'm not sure which one you prefer.
Well, I don't drink, but I think a nice haunch of dragon has always quenched my appetite for fire and blood. So good,
excellent. So why don't we just start off with how and when did you get into A Song of Ice and Fire?
Well, I tried very hard to avoid it because when I was growing up, I was an avid war gamer, and I loved historical games. I just wanted something that I felt was realistic and like based on fact and orderly. And so we always looked down at those people playing Dungeons and Dragons and dressing like elves and rolling magic spells. The great science fiction writer Larry Niven made this comment once about the problem with magic was that anybody could come up with anything to solve any plot hole. You know, here's my dragon. Aha, well, here's my spell of calling. Here's my 12 dragons, you know. So the problem, so I always just avoided fantasy, with the one exception being Tolkien, because I felt Tolkien, which was true, was creating a historical epic that had fantasy elements rather than the other way around. So later in life, not having a lot of time, career, family, somebody told me about this other historical epic, which was written with sort of a different mood, a different tone, but had that also quality of this is history with fantasy elements. And so I picked up Game of Thrones and I started reading the first 50 pages and I said, okay, I'm not going to read this. This is ridiculous. You know, walkers in the woods and magic and okay, never mind. But I had some friends that I trusted just keep pushing me. And so I tried again. And then I actually tried a third time, and then I finished the book, and I said, this is genius. I mean, this is exactly what I've been looking for, which was, you know, Tolkien 2.0, a very absolutely realistic historical epic that happens to have fantasy elements in it. So then I've been hooked since then.
Martin's, for the most part, is pretty good with building up to the magic, like slowly, and as you get hooked into it. Although you're right, the prologue is interesting that there's all this magical stuff going on, and you don't hear about it for a while.
Yeah, and I almost wonder whether, I mean, obviously he's got a billion fans now, but you almost wonder like if he had more of just a historical thing with it, just a little bit of magic, there would have been an entry point for wider audiences. But, you know, it's his choices as an author. But I think that's really what I appreciate. And I teach political communication. So I've spent, you know, my career studying how people persuade other people to do things, whether it's go to war, to win an election. And I've sort of looked at the history of how technology has affected that. So I'm fascinated as someone who's also a historian. I wrote a book about the history of the visualization of warfare and the history of political campaigns and how we go to war, about all the political manipulations going on. So this is a textbook, and one day I really look forward to teaching a course on political communication based on these books.
A friend of ours, Stefan in Germany, is teaching from the books right now. So there are people that are using it for teaching, and I feel it could fit quite well for that.
Yes.
Okay, so who are your favorite characters?
Well, I don't tend to have favorite characters who are favorite because I'd like to have a beer with them or because like I would support their faction if I were living in that world. I tend to like people who find themselves in dilemmas, and I'm sort of fascinated by the solutions they come up to it. So, for example, Stannis, which I don't think I've ever heard anybody say, oh, yeah, my favorite character, Stannis. You know, maybe in the history, I mean, you tell me. I mean, how many fans are on Team Stannis, you know, at convention?
A lot, actually.
Okay,
you'd be surprised on the Song of Ice and Fire board.
Yeah. So that's fascinating. But so taking King Stannis as an example of somebody who is consistently in the right, but goes through it. And if I were teaching a course, I'd have a checklist of every bad decision he made. And I'm not just talking about military decisions, but in terms of propaganda and persuasion, of winning over whether other lords to his cause or winning over people or winning over other factions. He's sort of a great, for a teacher's point of view, a great textbook example of how not to be an effective political leader. So that's what that attracts me. Cersei, of course, another example, I mean, of somebody who it never fails to be handed an opportunity that she fumbles and turns bad for her cause. And then on the other end of the spectrum, here's Tywin Lannister, who is a genius. I mean, he's a military genius, he's a political genius, but he also has that a quality of genius of not overstepping himself. He's always behind the scenes. I mean, certainly he's riding in the van of the army or something, but he's not giving lots of speeches from the tops of palaces to thousands of screaming people. But he makes a series of errors in misjudging really only one person's character. The whole book does he consistently misjudge about what he can do to that person and get away with it. And, well, that happens to be the person that kills him. So it shows how in life, as a political leader, you can you can be victorious 99% of the time, but 1% can come back and stab you, literally.
Well, I think Michael could probably confirm regards to Stannis that there's a surprising amount of people that were fans of him at the Ice and Fire convention.
Yeah, I'm sort of consistently. I mean, not that I'm not a Stannis hater or anything, so I don't get hate mail. But I'm always sort of surprised by the number of people who are Team Stannis.
Stannis the Manus is the meme.
Yeah, there's more people at conventions who are pro Stannis than in all of Westeros, right? Is that what you're saying?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, he needs to go through the time portal to our universe, I think, and run for president or something.
Yeah, Stannis 2016.
Yeah, Stannis now more than ever.
Who does he run with? Let's say Stannis Ned 2016. If you brought Ned
We're
back
dead, so we can't.
If you manage.
Well, it's vice president. You don't have to be that active. Right?
That's right.
Even Ned could.
That's true, yeah. You just need his name on the ticket. That'll bring the northern vote.
Since we're rolling into the topic here, I'm going to pull in Aziz as well, so we might as well jump into the topic. Because actually, in regards to Stannis and Tywin, we even have feedback from our listeners as well about what you just said and whether they're good at politics and communication or not.
Yeah, I was very impressed. You sent me some comments that people had posted, and I was really impressed by a lot of political analysis that was going on there, and I'm looking forward to talking about it.
Aziz, are you there?
Hey guys, how you doing?
How's it going?
Good.
So we got, I think you've met Michael before, I'm not sure, but we have Michael.
I'm not sure, maybe not.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Okay, we got Michael and we've got David here to talk about the subject I told you. We'll be talking about the politics and political communication of the factions. Give it back to David again if you wanted to
sure.
bring up
another book I think fans would be very interested in reading, because I loved, if I had 10 minutes with George R. R. Martin, I'd ask him, have you read this book? And I think the answer would be yes. And it's I bet it was one of his favorite books, is The White Company by Arthur Conan Doyle. Arthur Conan Doyle of Sherlock Holmes fame wrote a book called The White Company, which is about a warfare and a mercenary company in 14th century England, France. And it's about Edward the Black Prince, who was one of the great military leaders of the time, and some of the campaigns that he fought. But there are so many elements that in the world of Westeros. Now, of course, as I understand it, you know more than I do, George R. R. Martin is a medievalist. I mean, he studied the period, heraldry, knights, and things like that. So this wasn't pulling all of this out of thin air. The White Company is a terrific book to read. And one thing that fascinates me is that, you've heard the phrase, history is written by the winners. Actually, there's a lot of times where that's not true. The history of the American Civil War was pro-South for about 100 years after the American Civil War, and only in like the 60s and 70s did some of the sort of northern view and African-American view of the Civil War start entering historical discourse. So let's just take the Middle Ages. Where did we get our histories of the Middle Ages from? Well, a lot of times they were written by chroniclers. Well, the chroniclers were monks, or they were people working at a court. Now, the kings and the queens of the time, all the political leaders had at their propaganda, whether it was on coinage or, proclamations that they made. The chroniclers, some of them worked for individual factions, some of them were against individual factions. But the key point was that we often don't know what the people wanted. And I'll give you a very good example. Edward the Black Prince is considered to be, by most medieval chroniclers, the perfect knight. In fact, that's how he was referred to, the perfect knight. He was perfect in war, perfect in peace, perfect in love, perfect in dancing. He was perfect in everything. Yet, we keep hearing that his own peasants revolted all the time. which was probably due to the fact that he was always off fighting these wars, and so he was taxing the poor peasants to death. And so they didn't appreciate, oh, yeah, you're right. He's handsome. Yep, he's a great knight. On the other hand, he's taking all of my food from my children.
Like Richard Lionheart.
Exactly. So a lot of times the people who got the best equivalent of the press of the day were not necessarily as popular with the ordinary people. That's fascinating to me in the books. The first couple of books, I don't think Martin hits on this point, but eventually we start getting the sense that there's a huge discontent. And so, I'd love to talk about the good old times of King Robert, or how Daenerys is benefiting. The Targaryens are benefiting from not being there, so everybody can project everything they want to have happen to the golden age of the Targaryen faction. So there's a lot of stuff going on, but I think Martin does a tremendous job of showing that there are these noble factions, and they're sort of vying for support. They're vying for other nobles to join them up, but there's this other factor of the church, the septs and different factions there, and then the people who really need to be taken into account. And I get a sense as the books progress, they will play a greater role themselves.
Yeah, I guess what we could do is kind of look at each faction and talk about what they've done right and what they've done wrong. Starting with, let's start with Daenerys. Actually, do you guys think that she's good at managing communication in this way? Do you think she's had problems? What do you think?
Okay, so. Yeah, and by the way, it's interesting to me how none of the factions have anything but very small groups around them that have these discussions about, like, how would this look if we did this, right? And in other words, there's no strategic communication team there. They think of this stuff up themselves. Tywin Lannister might have a conversation with Tyrion or something like that, where they decide. But a lot of these people seem to be just doing it themselves without thinking about it. Now, Daenerys, she has a tiny staff, right? And they're mostly like warriors. And so she a lot of the conversations about, like, how would this look and how can I win over these people or this city are done just with a few people or with herself. Now, back in Westeros, I think if you could do a public opinion survey that was valid, which really would be hard, of the people, whether it's city people or peasant people back in Westeros, I bet you would find Daenerys winning the election, because I think everybody all of the factions, you can go down the checklist of every faction in Westeros has alienated lots of people by first losing or causing lots of destruction or not showing that they don't really care about anybody but themselves. And Daenerys has had and her faction have benefited from simply not being around,
Yeah, I think in the Westeros that is the case, but in the region that she's in, I think she's in some ways lost to the Yonkai. They seem to be able to stir up a lot of hate in her in areas that she's not even related with.
Westeros, because I'm just talking about where she isn't. Now that's a point you made. A great point is that where she is, she isn't proving that adept at winning over enemies. There's an old saying that some people can make friends by the way they say no, and some people can make enemies by the way they say yes. And there were some politicians, John F. Kennedy was a legend for this, who are just charming, and they seem to win over people who even start out as enemies. And she does not have that quality, at least in the way that George R. R. Martin has sketched her out. But back in Westeros, when the moment comes, which I'm assuming is going to happen, when she lands on Westeros, I think if somebody were describing it realistically, I think there would be a lot of people who would flock to her banner.
Yeah, and I think Michael might be able to speak to this as well, but Aegon going there might affect things. Yes, there was a desire maybe for Targaryens to go there, and maybe that was Alyra's plan in the whole beginning, is to wait till things got bad enough that they could bring Aegon in instead, not Daenerys. But what do you guys think the effect of Aegon going there before Dany might have on Dany's arrival?
Yeah, I could see that. I could definitely see that splitting the Targaryen vote, so to speak. And I don't know. I think the fact that Dany's a woman probably is not going to help her out. And I don't know. I guess the dragons would probably swing it back towards her pretty strongly.
Yeah, dragons are a good tool when it comes to propaganda.
They have to reduce the amount of peasant girls they eat, though, because that doesn't look good in the evening news. The optics of that are pretty bad. And I could see the attack ad by the opposition, like, have your children eaten? No, don't vote for Daenerys. Yeah, in terms of splitting the vote, this is all fascinating from the world of politics, like faction splitting votes. It's like, in the United States, we have two political parties and no others. But in many other countries where they have a parliamentary system, they have multiple political parties. And oftentimes they're splinter factions of one or the other. They might be a liberal party or a conservative party might split in two. And so that's going to be fascinating to see whether there's two Targaryen factions or not.
And Aziz is back, so I want to ask, what do you think about Dany herself? Do you think she's good at the political game or not?
I don't think she's great at it, but I think she's overcomes it by just being so dominant and strong. I think that she's learning the value of it. Like she starts off as a character who's just very headstrong. She just wants to do. She gets these ideas. And she isn't apologetic about it. She thinks this is the right thing to do. This is what we have to do. She's not really much compromise early on, although she's starting to learn why that's necessary. So she kind of came in with in an unusual position of not having to do a lot of compromising. It was never really forced on her. She always could. She was kind of entitled in a few ways, not necessarily in a bad way, but in a way that's certainly relevant to setting up her own expectations and understanding how things work. Once she kind of got into Slaver's Bay and realized once she got done conquering and started trying to rule, she started to realize how much compromise mattered. You can see that she adapted to it pretty well. I mean, she went from kind of not having any sort of not being very amiable to compromise, and then now she's willing to marry his Darza Lorak. So that's I give her a lot of credit for adapting and for understanding. But as far as her total arc, I'd say she started off without much of a clue in terms of that, and she's learning quickly. And I think that it remains to be seen how much propaganda will be a tool for her in the future. But I think, given the points about a possible second Dance with Dragons, which I think is very likely, I think that's when it's really going to start to matter a lot for her. I think she's really going to have to master these things, or she's going to find somebody that understands it. I mean, Tyrion seems like the obvious candidate who's going to teach her even more along those lines. And it'll be interesting to see whether she finds is kind of disgusted by some of these things, like she has having to kind of tell lies for the sake of politics, whether or not she's going to be willing to do that, or how far she'll bend, or what.
Yeah, I think Tyrion is the game changer there. I mean, if I were going to bet on factions, I'd say, boy, Daenerys plus dragons plus Tyrion, that's a winning team. And the question, though, is as usual, is that, will she listen to him, or will he find himself in a sort of quasi Cersei-like situation where he knows what the best thing to do is, but he's dealing with somebody who does not pay attention to what he's advising. I mean, that's always a perennial problem with advisors. When do you actually listen to him? And also his motivations. I mean, right now, his entire motivation is, at least as I read it, but you guys are much more insightful and know more about that, but is revenge. And if I were Daenerys, I'd go like, okay, you're using me to get your ends. You're not pro me, you're anti somebody else, and that can run out at some point. So she has a lot of reasons to doubt whether he's actually going to be a good advisor or not. Although my bet is that he will always give her the best advice that he can.
Well, their meeting is one of the things I'm looking forward to. I mean, it was such a tease in Dance with Dragons where they were so close to each other. We didn't actually get a meeting yet to see what that interaction is going to be like.
Yeah, we're going to see it on the TV show before we see it in the books, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Which is why we may
I like
have to
that
stop
reaction.
watching.
Everybody's like, eh.
Well, these are the things I want to read in the book first. I don't want to, or if I want to see it on the show, let it be a change or something, right? I would rather have that be their own interpretation.
I agree. Yeah, I think hopefully it will be different enough in the book that it'll feel kind of like new, even though we've already kind of tread the ground in a sense.
But there is one thing I do have to say, just in relation to Dany and propaganda, which is not even her fault. Partly she could have handled the way Quentin was handled a little better. And now if people go back to Dorne, basically they're going to get like this telephone garbled message of like how she laughed at Quentin and burned him, and I think that could turn all the Dornish against her. But that's not necessarily what happened, but that's the story they're going to hear.
Well, a wonderful show. Again, I recommend the book, The White Company, but there was a version of the life of Elizabeth, the first Elizabeth, Queen of England, called Elizabeth R. It was like a BBC miniseries, and you can just look it up on YouTube with the great actress Glenda Jackson playing Elizabeth. And because it was the length of a miniseries, he was able to play out all the political machinations that went on across Elizabeth's reign. And basically, for almost her entire reign, she kept almost marrying people. And that was very beneficial to her because she was basically stringing along a lot of factions who might have unified to kill her, but they all had their hopes that, okay, she's going to marry me. And so I thought that was the direction. Maybe it isn't, but originally when the character came up with the question of who should we marry, I thought that she would basically be doing Elizabeth, where she would never marry, but she would string people along to win them to at least temporarily to her cause, and then drop them and pick up somebody else. And Elizabeth R., Elizabeth the Queen, did that practically for 40 years. So we have a historical example. And again, I know George R. R. Martin pays attention to history.
Well, but unlike Elizabeth, she has potential to marry multiple people, which is at the same time.
Yeah,
which is an advantage. But so that's one advantage she has. Okay, so what I want to do now is if David can bring up, you were talking about Stannis, bring up the case of why you think Stannis is not good at this, and then if Aziz and Michael can try to counter that.
Yeah, I mean, there's an old saying that you can't be too virtuous in politics, and Stannis is concerned about what is absolutely to the letter of the law right, so he is the rightful king. The law must be obeyed. He systematically does things, even if you're thinking, well, gee, that's alienating this faction, or yeah, you're not winning this person over to your support, or be realistic. Like, Renly really would have been the best carrier of the cause. I mean, he's just so wrapped up in virtue and rightness that it's almost like he ignores political communication. Now, the big exception, of course, is he loses the battle of the blanking
Blackwater.
Yeah,
Blackwater.
He loses the Battle of Blackwater, and he's sort of flailing around and going like, okay, where do I attack next? What do I do? What dice do I roll to get my cause? And boom, he appears up in the north. Now that's interesting because he's obviously consciously saying, I'm acting like a king. I'm doing what the king should be doing, which is defending the realm, instead of what these other people are doing, fighting each other. Now that's a very strong message. I mean, if I were on the team putting together the 7-second soundbite for Team Stannis, I'd say, Stannis, the only king who's actually acting like a king, doing what the king is supposed to do.
Stannis defends the borders.
Which is what are kings supposed to do? Ensure internal peace and defend the borders, right? And all these other factions are ignoring the borders. I mean, they're not helping the Black Watch anything, and they're all just fighting each other, and they're causing more chaos and more chaos. The descriptions George R. R. Martin has of the destruction of the wars, this is just building up, and this is why, you see people again projecting onto the Targaryen faction like, gee, we didn't have. I mean, actually, there were civil wars, of course, in the Targaryen times, but people physically don't remember them; they weren't there. And then in the times of good King Robert, Robert's very interesting, by the way, because we know he was a bad king, good knight, bad king, because we got to see him up close and personal. But of course, in the Middle Ages, unlike today where you can just see Obama anytime you want, very few people got to see the king or certainly hang out with him and see what he was doing on his spare time. So to the average peasant, the taxes were okay, but not too bad. And there was generally peace during King Robert's time. The big debt that he was racking up had not really ruined the economy yet. It probably would have in 5 or 6 years later. So from the point of view of the average peasant, those were the good old days of King Robert. But that faction has nobody left to channel that good feeling towards. I mean, there's nobody in there for them to say, okay, great. Now, he'll be another good King Robert and we'll have peace again.
Yeah, it's sort of like that was sort of Stannis's. Well, once Renly was dead, that was kind of Stannis's to lose, and I think you're right. He hasn't taken any advantage of the fact that Robert was his brother in terms of that kind of thing. It's all just right. I'm rightful this, rightful that kind of.
Well, the drives to the north, I think, did. I mean, again, if I were his advisor, I'd say that was at least in concept. I mean, it was a huge risk, and of course, it eventually failed, but it was the right thing to do in terms of getting good propaganda.
Yeah, I think that was certainly well played.
I wouldn't say it would. Why would you think it would fail necessarily? I mean, it's tough times right now, but it could still come out on top.
You're right. I mean, it wasn't like suddenly all the northern factions, oh yes, now you're our savior. We're going to turn to you. The plans of Tywin are still rolling forward rather successfully.
Well, I would say, let's roll into Thailand shortly, but I mean, like Manderley, for example, seems to be, at least on the surface, won over if they bring him as his lord. Like, so he's winning over some people there. Like, he's uniting the anti-Bolton faction.
Yes. I'm just saying it wasn't some sort of amazing coup that turned the whole situation around.
But sticking around is enough, it seems. Other people die, eventually, Stannis.
Well, eventually they'll be. I mean, actually, what happened in the Middle Ages was that there was a general massacre, not by peasants, but like each other. I mean, there's so many noble families died out because they had no male heirs left because there were so many of them were killed in battle. So we're watching again something very realistic, which is that the rise of people from low hedge knights. A lot of the great families of Europe were essentially hedge knights who, one was a warlord who did well in battle. And then, 2 generations later, they're the Duke of Anjou, So we can see that. And then I think there's going to be other factions that will arise that, people we don't even know about will become prominent because war opens up those possibilities.
You kind of see that if you look at the Hedge Knight and earlier works, like there's a lot of families there that you don't even hear about anymore, just gone now.
Yeah, I mean they pull a Castamere,
Yeah.
and Castamere is obviously the most famous family line that's been wiped out, and the castle left up there to remind everybody what happens.
Well, they have the whole song, right? Which is again a good use by Tywin. But I feel like one more plus for Tywin is, like, for example, I mean, he's responsible for the Red Wedding, but for the most part, he's shifted the blame onto the Freys, which is a huge advantage. I mean, you don't want to be held responsible for it.
Right, and that's what I would call, I mean, we use the term Machiavellian, but there were many people through history. Count Richelieu, of France, was very famous for that he would have, people. He would pull off assassinations and executions, and people would disappear, but it wouldn't be tied to him, So it would be other people sort of committing suicide. But he's the man. He's the guy. And to use mafia terms, soprano terms, he's the guy behind the guy behind the guy. But the blood isn't spilled exactly on his hands. Yes.
So, Aziz, is there anyone in particular that you would add to the list of being good at the political and propaganda game?
Well, I wanted to, maybe not specific names, but I would say that there's an aspect to the propaganda that's interesting that is sort of set in stone, or at least maybe not in stone, but set up ahead of any of these of any of these individuals or the current times, and that is the propaganda that's kind of existed over time associated with some of these houses. Like, for example, a Lannister always pays his debts is a very mild piece of propaganda, but people have been saying that apparently for centuries. And I think that certainly qualifies as propaganda. It's not, the kind of nation-moving type, but it certainly counts. And there's a lot of those things. There's a lot of propaganda kind of built up into some of these houses and their words and their place. And like the Starks, everyone just assumes that for the most part, and there's a religious significance to it, that it's really important for the Starks to be in charge. And a lot of people don't necessarily know why. There's no one ever says why the Starks have to be in charge, but they just do it. They assume that things have always been good under the Starks, but none of them really know what it would be like under somebody else. So, so I think that to me is one of the real fascinating aspects of where the origins of some of these propaganda come from, just from history, and come from these families have built it up over the generations and have kind of carried it on. And, that when you introduced me to this topic, that's kind of where my head went. I started thinking about the history of propaganda rather than the current stuff. That's kind of always what I do.
Yeah. Well, and for the Starks, I mean, what we found out from World of Ice and Fire is most of the other families in the north, more than other regions, had been kings themselves or petty kings, and yet everyone pretty much except for Bolton accepts there must be a Stark in Winterfell. Even Bolton accepts that by having a fake Stark there. That's true, and you wonder if there is like maybe there is an important reason for that. Maybe there's actually some sort of magical supernatural reason. I don't really, getting into that would be a whole nother topic, even if that's not a dead end. But for whatever reason, everyone's convinced, and I'm sure the Starks, encourage that thinking, whether it's true or not, because it certainly benefits them. We all think of the current Starks
And, for the most part, you either think of them as good or maybe incompetent, but, generally good people. But obviously that wasn't always like that. There have been Starks who were, terrible people and Starks that were cruel. And I'm sure they weren't above using the house's reputation to further their own ends, etc. Another example would be the Arryns. The Arryns, you have their built-in propaganda is that they are the purest form. They're the purest Andal line, the highest line of Andal nobility that exists in Westeros, and they're not going to stop talking about that anytime soon. And bloodlines are so important. Everybody is of the mind that, the family that you're attached to, the bloodline that you come from is one of the most important, if not the most important thing about who you are. So if you can get people to believe that you're part of a family, or that you can get people to believe that, you are worthy of something associated with that family, that's huge.
Yeah, I'm thinking for Tyrion, when he was first imprisoned up in the Eyrie there, he teaches his jailer about a Lannister pays his debts. And, that saves his life. I mean, not that jailer necessarily said, oh, you're a Lannister, so I actually think that you will give me gold, but that he, by following through on the family, the unofficial motto as opposed to the official motto, that he was able to win an individual over. So that's a very good example. I do think we always have to ask the question, though, of audiences. And again, I teach political communication. I always tell people, the meaning of something is in the audience. It's not in the sender. So you always wonder, like, okay, we have the most pure bloodline, but again, do the peasants in the villages who are being overrun while the Lord hides up in the Eyrie, are they saying, well, it's okay, my farm was just burned, but it's okay because I'm loyal to somebody with a pure bloodline? I think all of that is falling apart. And I think, again, George R. R. Martin he doesn't do entire chapters on this, but he gives a good portrait of a world just falling apart completely. And who is going to come in and be the savior and pick up the pieces?
Yeah, Lannisters always pays their debts is well known, but another one that's becoming well known now is Lannister's lie, which is not the best thing for them. But in speaking of bloodlines and chaos and lack of bloodline, somebody who comes from a low bloodline, Littlefinger, I'm interested in what you guys think about him in relation to this topic.
Yeah, well, Littlefinger, certainly I'm like all readers. I was like stunned at the different revelations about him. And I'm going like, well, wait a minute. Is this entire book actually written by Littlefinger? Like, this is his memoirs, And like, in book 7, he's sitting on the throne. He's saying, well, I think, I'd like to write of how I came to be the Lord of Earth. Because you're going like, what this, Tywin, I would put him as political genius there. But Littlefinger, it is almost stunning in his abilities to sort of read people, guess what people are going to do next, and play this very deft game. And I'm just wondering, and again, this is not an actual historical event, but what George R. R. Martin is going to decide, is he ever going to make this guy completely stumble and fail?
Any other comments on him?
I think that covered it pretty well.
But on the other hand, if he rode to the fore at a battle and said, "Follow me," I think most people would go either who or like no.
Yeah, he has almost no public profile, and to the extent that he does,
be public about it. But Sansa could gain the abilities, and she can be public about it.
That's true. Yeah. Littlefinger's definitely like a behind the scenes.
Yeah, he lacks the thing we were just speaking of. He doesn't have the bloodlines. No matter what he does, there's no way around that, and that hurts his power, his ceiling. That lowers his ceiling as far as commanding, being a military leader.
But his ambition seems unlimited. So I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess that would be an interesting question for the fans as well. Is there any scenario where you could actually imagine that when all the smoke clears, there's Littlefinger on the throne of Westeros? No, I can imagine him as the guy behind the guy. The guy behind the king. But I have a hard time imagining him sitting there with holding Daenerys, Dany's hand and saying, okay, well, that's it, we game over, we win.
In one sense, you could say he could be like, he started out with the type, he's mad at his ceiling, therefore I'm going to just bring the ceiling down, just cause chaos. But on the other hand, I think he knows his limitations of how high he can publicly appear.
Well, historically, it's a very dangerous thing for a politician to be successful without any problems, because you begin to get hypnotized. And a lot of great is in like terrible but successful dictators stumble. Saddam Hussein, Hitler, Muammar Gaddafi. They're very successful earlier in their career, and they begin to think like everything I do is genius and I'm always right. And then they start making major errors that lead to their downfall. Part of it, of course, is the public eye. There's a famous observation made about Fidel Castro. I think it was by one of his brothers that defected away from communism, went to Florida, said that Fidel was a pretty good guy until he spoke in the Casa Rosada and 600,000 people chanted his name. And then he became what he is. And so the thing about Littlefinger is that he's got no cheering multitudes to hypnotize him into thinking that he's always right and he can never do wrong. So he might actually stay wise his whole career.
Just an example of like how he's aware. I mean, he might not exactly do this plan, but he was saying how like when you reveal Sansa to the Knights of the Vale at the right time and wearing your cloak, every Knight of the Vale will swear to bring you back your birth. Like he's able to manipulate people or know like what he's playing with if he actually does that plan.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, is there any other? We're looking at time wise. Is there one or other two people you want to talk or bring up, David, before we move on to the chapter?
Yeah, I think we should bring Dorne into the discussion because Dorne, of course, is the geographically, figuratively, politically the outlier in Westeros, and not always involved in everybody's calculations, and they're playing their own game. Now, obviously, they had individual factions there. Let's call them the War Party, the Assassination Party, the let's go to the Targaryen Party, let's bide our time Party. All these things. Sort of struggling for dominance there. Dorne, you'd think, has the strongest cards because they're the one. Their lands have not been ravaged by war. Their tax base is intact. Their armies are intact. They could be united if they got their act together. I think the original plan to hey, let's go marry the dragon was brilliant and would have combined in terms of propaganda efforts a unification of Dorne and a unification of a lot of factions and especially I think common people hoping for a peace in Westeros. Whether it's going to actually work or not, I guess I don't see it panning out.
Yeah, and they're good at Dragon exaggerated their numbers, and they themselves did the same thing. So they're good at that kind of manipulation of the numbers and the way they're seen by the rest of the realm.
Yeah, we haven't seen them in action, Well,
I don't know if you read World of Ice and Fire though. Dorne Martell kind of downplays what they're capable of. But when it comes to defending Dorne, they're very good at it. Maybe they're not as good as leading armies and fighting elsewhere in Westeros, but in a defensive war, they're very good.
Yeah, there aren't a lot of examples of them going. There are a few notable examples of them going outside of Dorne to do things, but there's not that. Yeah. They're not conquest. They're destruction.
Yeah.
They sacked Highgarden,
I think, and Highgarden.
burning the Rainwood, and sending assassins after Aegon and his sister, stuff like that. They're capable of doing dangerous things, but conquest, that's that's not their thing.
They'd have to be part of an allied army, But you could imagine an army that was Dorne plus dragons plus whatever Daenerys is able to bring over the sea, plus a lot of
everyone
factions from Westeros. Again, I just think that if there were a unified Targaryen banner, raised, you would just see so many. Right now there's confusion, but if it was an absolutely clear signal, I've come to bring peace. Let's get rid of all these squabbling people who've destroyed the land, and I've come to bring peace. And Dorne was there with their army. I think you'd see a unification that didn't exist before. And also, I think it's really important to know, I'm almost fascinated. You see these dictators, Saddam Hussein, Nicolae Ceausescu, Muammar Gaddafi, they do give these speeches and 500,000 people scream their name. They all die alone in a rat hole, with nobody willing to fight to the death for them. It's a sort of interesting thing. With the exception of Hitler, of course, but a lot of famous dictators who seem incredibly popular when it actually comes push down to shove, their popularity was just based on terror, bribing, threats, fear, and nobody's actually willing to fight for them. And you wonder whether, just talking about the Lannisters and all these other factions, they're systematically alienating anybody who would be like a sincere supporter. So if the Lannisters ever ran out of gold, I don't think a lot of people would be loyal to the Lannisters.
Well, just look like what happened to them after Tywin died. His legacy is starting to fall apart, whereas in Dance of Dragons, everyone's willing to do everything for the Ned.
Yeah, it's clear that Tywin was... I mean, not that we didn't know that, but it's clear that without Tywin, it's a totally different picture. I mean, it changed a totally different picture for everyone. For John Connington and for Stannis and for it's just, wow, Tywin's gone. The Lannisters are weak. And that's kind of a funny piece of propaganda, like behind the scenes propaganda that the leaders could be using. Is like, hey, look, do you really want to support this side now that Tywin's gone? Wouldn't you rather be on the winning side? Yeah. You're on the side that's being ruled by Cersei, and and the same ones that produced Joffrey and all these, like, you can't. Yeah, is that who you want to be with?
I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
That's all I
was saying it's a very good point. There's an interesting historical parallel. Nicholas II, the Tsar of Russia, when Russia collapsed in World War I and communism and civil war, he was notable in history for being a really inept ruler. I mean, just whenever he could make a bad decision, that's what he did. Well, a little historical footnote: his father, who was a very strong Tsar, kept his son politically ignorant, like didn't train him to be a Tsar, and was planning to start training him to be a Tsar when his son turned 25 or 30. I forget what it was. But the previous Tsar, his father, didn't count on like dying. So, if you want your family empire and legacy to live on, you have to take into account your own death. And Tywin built this empire, but it was all connected to him personally, his connections, the fear he instilled, the bribes he made, the favors he garnered. And so, yeah, when the central edifice is broken like that, you can see there's no one. He never planned. I mean, the only person who could have stepped in was the one who killed him. I mean, the only person who over, behind, and actually could have done everything behind the scenes just as effectively as he did, was Tyrion.
It's a kind of a microcosm of Alexander the Great, him dying. I mean, Tywin wasn't ruling this vast empire that had been recently conquered, but it's the same thing. There was nobody capable of taking his place and keeping things going the way they were. And everyone kind of knew it, but Tywin's death was sudden, just like Alexander's.
And Alexander in his deathbed, supposedly he was asked to take over the empire, and he said the strongest, but he didn't. He was not figuring out. Okay, nobody actually was strongest. So,
yeah, it was a very Aegon the Fourth type thing to do. A real dick move there. Funeral games indeed. One thing about Dorne that's interesting too, that this was brought up when we were talking about the North and how the North was really fractured and how the Starks took a long time to unite the kingdom. That was kind of the case in Dorne as well for similar reasons. The desert and a lot of the natural borders caused more individual kingdoms, and that sense of independence is still maintained. So I think that from a historical perspective, Dorne's from a historical propaganda perspective, Dorne is known to be a place that is hostile to invaders, and that's not really propaganda. That's just true. I guess it's still true. It hasn't been tested recently, but it's probably in the memory of people who are in the know are aware of the histories and knowing that Dorne is a really hard place to conquer because of the small folk in particular are stubborn. But also, there's less control wielded by the overlord. Sunspear doesn't have the control over Dorne, especially under Doran, than that, say, a lot of the other kingdoms have over their own dominions, because they're fractured, they're independent, and Doran is not a strong ruler in the sense of he pushes people around. They know that people know that they can get away with things under him. It's just a matter of how much they can push. But the thing that I think is most interesting in terms of propaganda isn't the propaganda of Dorne to Dorne. It's Dorne facing outward, and Dorne says it himself. I hope they hear, people will, when he imprisons the Sand Snakes, there's that moment where I think it's Areo Hotah says there will be howling in the streets. And he says, I hope Tywin Lannister hears that howling and hears that we have, so he knows that he has a loyal friend down here in Dorne. So Dorne has carefully kept Dorne to looking like at least a passive ally of the throne, rather than the revenge plotting schemers that they really are. And that, I think, is huge. And it's changed now that Tywin's dead. So
you think Tywin? I mean, I think we have enough. We're impressed by his ability that I'm sure he wasn't actually fooled. But, there's fooled, and like we both agree that we're actually planning to stab each other, but we'll stay allied until we actually do.
Yeah.
And there's actually being fooled. I don't think anybody was thinking like, Dorne, yeah, they're willing to sacrifice everything for the Lannister cause. No,
yeah, it was more like how big of a threat are they? And Dorne is like, well, we're going to play nice for now. We're not a threat. Look how nice and passive I am. Yeah, you're right. It's not more of he trusts us. It's he doesn't see us as a threat. We're manageable. We're manageable to him. We're not at the top of his list. He's got bigger problems. As long as we're not his top problem, we can keep doing what we're doing and building up our strength and working on our revenge behind the scenes.
I want to bring up what a fan wrote in because you sent me some of the fan
sure.
comments.
Yeah, our listeners.
Pretty brilliant observation, and I want to quote, it's I. Wendell wrote this. Worst communication strategy goes to Night Watch, hands down. They managed to let their public image sink to that of a, quote, ragged band of poachers and rapers who fight grumpkins and snarks, end quote. I thought that was a very good point, is that, the Night Watch, boy, they have to spend a little bit more on strategic communications here, because they're almost Stannis-like, and they're focused on just, under the leadership of Mormont anyway, and then Snow, they're just focused on doing their job. And, you never know how you've ever met somebody who is a pretty good person, but like wants you to know he's a good person and really wants everybody like, hey, I'm virtuous. Everybody notice how virtuous I am, and assumes you're going to be their friend just because on the strength of their natural virtue. They don't actually have to do anything. And so they're doing their job up there, but they've forgotten that part of their job is also convincing the rest of the kingdom that their job is important. And it's almost pathetic how many times they send out these appeals like, hey, by the way, guys, the whole kingdom's going to be overrun, for God's sakes. Yeah, we'll send you 7 robbers and 3 rapists, and you fight off that massive army with those guys. Let us know how it turns out. Nobody. I mean, even Tywin is not. He's not panicked by what's going on up there. So this fan Iwindale made a very good point about like faction that needs the most help on propaganda.
Yeah, that's quite true.
Yeah, I mean, they really just need anybody to go up there. I guess, like, if Tyrion had gone up there, a year later or something like that. But they need somebody.
Well, Ned
like
was actually sent to the wall. Would have been good. He would
sure, yeah, absolutely.
And be like, hey, Ned,
yep,
he's working at the wall. Big celebrity at the wall.
Yeah, but they really need somebody who's well known in the South or just in the kingdom in general to go up there and then go back. As opposed to because it's always just like these, like they sent Thorne down there or whatever, and like Thorne's an asshole and nobody likes him and nobody knows who he is, and so it's like, all right, well, you say you had a hand.
Well, they send Yoren, who just stinks and he's dirty. It's like, it's
exactly.
not the best PR guy to send. Now, unfortunately, time-wise, I'm starting to run out of time, so we should probably move on to the chapter if that's okay with you guys. Like, I got about 20 minutes left, so. Let's move on to what we're covering is Davos I from A Storm of Swords. Just in terms of review, basically, it's Davos after the Blackwater. He's nearly died. He escaped. He managed to survive somehow on this little tiny island, and he's thinking about whether he wants to live or die, and he decides, kind of has a religious vision revelation, where he decides, I've turned my back on the Seven. I've got to turn back to them and live for my family and try to stop Melisandre and try to support Stannis. So that's what he's going to do. And basically, I just wrote down some various comments while going through the chapter. So let's just move in from the start of the chapter. If you have something early in the chapter, just say it and we'll discuss. Let's see here.
Sounds good. Let's get this thing open.
Just one quick one right there is, Davos's ship, the Black Betha, or one of his ships is
That's his main ship, yeah.
What's the history of that name? Is actually known to us now, right?
Yeah, Black Betha was Aegon V's queen, Betha Blackwood, and of course she is the great-grandmother of Daenerys, as well as a couple other Targaryens. Which is interesting, we were talking about the bloodlines the other day as well. It's kind of neat, just as a slight segue. Since Black Betha's children were Jaehaerys II and Shera Targaryen, they married each other, so they were both half Blackwood by that standard. And then Jaehaerys II's children were Aerys and Rhaella, and they were both technically half Blackwood, the same proportions of blood, since it was just two brother-sister marriages. So by some standards, Daenerys would be half Blackwood. which is kind of.
By the way, I'm in awe that you know things like that. I don't think I could family tree, So
That's why they call his podcast History of Westeros, right? So,
yeah, that's right.
Although I mean, we've all been reading the World of Ice and Fire. I don't know if you managed to get your hands on that yet.
No, I have not.
Yeah, you definitely want to try that out.
Yeah, it's great. It reads like a history book because it's full of its own inaccuracies, just like real history.
Well, I think I mentioned that I had no role in it, but I went to some very early science fiction conventions. This was the time where the Star Trek cast were basically making their living from the appearances. The movie had not appeared, so the phenomenon of Star Trek was just, it was this failed TV series that had some geek fans who were still interested in it. And I just remember the very first time I saw people like walk into a Marriott hotel dressed like an alien or dressed like a Starship Enterprise board member. And so it's funny now. I haven't actually gone to a Comic-Con to see the cosplay world that goes on now. You go like, oh, well, I was there when it began with this tiny little egg, and now it's this massive enterprise with hundreds of thousands of people involved in it.
I mean, George used to openly go to Comic-Con and just go into panels and stuff and watch stuff, but he can't do that anymore.
He still goes to the small cons, which is great because he's still very accessible at the small. Well, I don't know how accessible he is at some of the others, but our experience at one particular small con was great. He just he came into a hotel party, just walked on in. In someone's room, just one of those standard con parties that evolves in someone's hotel, or he just walked right in and hung out for a while. And
see, if I were him, not only with his wealth, but I would have a huge bodyguard of medieval knights.
I think that's the Brotherhood without banners.
Yeah, exactly.
But they're the Brotherhood without weapons.
He just walks around and people can go up to him on the street. I mean, I would have 12 7-foot. Former basketball players, heavy plate metal.
You should have a George guard.
Left and right.
Left and right, the George guard, the Martin.
No, there was a newspaper article that published where his house was and putting pictures up, and I'm just how disrespectful can you be?
I know, that's unbelievable. They actually put his address up. Are you people kidding me?
Yeah. Actually, his house was broken.
I heard that when you ring his doorbell, hot boiling wildfire pours down.
I think he's getting that installed. He's got to still. It's hard to get wildfire these days. It's harder to produce.
So Davos is on this island, and I guess it's a pretty straightforward chapter. He's having these memory. Actually, it's a good example though of the issue of Stannis. Is that here is probably the one person. Except maybe I wouldn't even count Stannis' wife, but the one person in Westeros who is genuinely loyal to Stannis because of personal qualities he sees in Stannis. I mean, and especially this is a guy who's surrendered. I mean, his sons have died in the cause. You think the historical parallel, you see the cause of the Jacobite cause in Scotland and Ireland, where people died for this losing cause, but yet they were, the next time the rebellion happened, their grandsons were loyal to the Jacobite kings. So I think Davos is a good example of what Stannis the kind of thing he could have inspired if he just had some of the qualities of mix some Renly in there with some Ned Stark, with a little bit of Tyrion. He could have been a much more effective ruler in terms of winning people over.
Well, I think that Stannis is learning. I mean, when I first read, I didn't like Stannis that much, but also I like him more in the reread. But I feel by the 5th book, he has changed from Stannis in the 2nd book. He's becoming more pragmatic, more practical at times.
Yeah, he's suffered. He learns, and then the more setbacks he has, the more he realizes that he has to be a bit more flexible. I wouldn't call him flexible. He's still Stannis, but he is not a rigid, unchanging character either. Not completely rigid. Let's put it this way. He's very stubborn, but his intelligence trumps his stubbornness, and he realizes that he's, it's when it comes down to the two, he will grudgingly go with what his intelligence tells him and not stick to his guns when his guns are misfiring.
Yeah, and that brings up also the question of this is somebody survived, the last survivor of a ship on a small island, of luck. And there's a famous quote from Napoleon where somebody was told, you should promote this guy to general. He's really skilled, he's really qualified. Napoleon said, yeah, that's all very interesting, but is he lucky? And in politics, there is this quality of like, are you lucky? And I find it sort of fascinating. Now, of course, again, we're dealing with not a real world here. We're dealing with a created world in one person's mind. But Stannis is a hard luck guy. I mean,
yeah.
Oh, he's a middle child.
Yeah.
I mean, he's had the luck of like, Renly. I mean, he would have lost that battle with Renly, but like he just can't get a break. And so you almost wonder, absolutely, a lot of people never change in life, that they get just the pride or ego get in the way and they just keep failing because they can't adapt. And so it is a very good example. And this is why I consider Ice and Fire to be literature and not just, a good read, is that you see the evolution of a character, and Stannis is a very good example of that. And you wonder, you could project by the 7th book, maybe he'll become a good king.
I think that, some people speculated that, I don't think there'll be a Night's Watch at the end, but if there had been, he could have been in the Night's Watch.
Yeah, he'd be a great Lord Commander of the Night's Watch.
I think they'll resolve it one way or the other, though, by the end. I don't think there's going to be a night.
Yeah, I don't expect him to survive the series necessarily, but I think he's more likely than a lot of others. He could be an interesting.
He's got to make it until when Dany gets there, at least. You'd think.
Yeah, it's true.
Unless he's undead, but he's going to be there at some point because just the power of prophecy is.
Well, I know for a fact he's going to marry Caitlyn.
He has to die. He has to die first.
Stannis
and both be
going to be pretty powerful people, that I would like fear and obey.
We're working on a episode over here at History of West. We're working on a Night's King episode, and one of the parts of that is talking about what parallels to the modern stories. And Stannis is a top candidate for the parallel to Night's King. Partly because of Melisandre and some other things. But, he's reopening the Night Fort and going to live there. Like, that's pretty straightforward. But there's a lot more than that, but yeah.
The whole Macbeth and Lady Macbeth thing, too. Melisandre and him.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the whole thing is that the Night's Queen was a corpse queen that, that when he gave his seed to her, she took part of his soul. That's exactly what happened. I mean, Melisandre describes
She's just a fire version of a corpse queen, basically. And she could be really old. She's glamored up.
Yeah, she's essentially. I mean, even what's her name, Carice Van Houten has said in an interview that her character is over 100 years old. Even the TV actress knows that. So we're not sure how old Melisandre really is, but she's old. She doesn't look that good.
We know that she does glamours, and one of the things she actually mentions in the Dance of Dragons as like things that you can use to make glamour is a bag of finger bones, which is what Davos loses in this chapter. He's lost it. So then some people speculate like that maybe his finger bones were switched out before he lost them, and she has them for whatever purpose, like that she may want to pretend to be Davos or to use his son to pretend to be like because Stannis does trust Davos, right?
Yeah, that whole not that of course it's a bit of a tangent, of course, but that chapter's really confusing because everybody thought Melisandre was like just conning Stannis or whatever, and then you see inside her head she's got all these. She's actually got compassion, and she's just wrong. She's not just. She's not just misleading
pure
Stannis
evil. She thinks she's doing right. She might still do evil, but she's not a con job.
Right. She's definitely not out for herself. We know that much. At least as far as that one chapter inside her head showed us. But anyway, that's a tangent.
All right. Let's see what else we got in this chapter.
So Davos. Yeah. Davos is, before this chapter, it's really interesting because this is the first of two chapters where a main character seems to be drowning. Obviously, Tyrion is the later one. And they both end where it appears that they're drowning, and the next thing you know, they're fine. Well, Davos isn't fine, but he's not drowned.
Not dead, yeah.
Yeah, so, I wanted to bring that one quality up there. I did the Tolkien professor guy has a wonderful podcast on Tolkien, and I was on an episode talking about battles in Tolkien, and I said, let's face it, one of the problems of Tolkien is that whenever he does a battle, it's like a little kid playing soldiers that he suddenly, and the elves rode in and the Rohirrim rode in, and a lot of the battles have this here are the Eagles, the Eagles are always showing up just at the last minute to save the day. And I always like about George R. Martin's battles is that they actually came off, and I know that could be a whole separate episode. He didn't miraculously rescue people. Actually, I thought this was done really well. He's there on an island and he's miserable, and it is an island. It's not like it's an island in the South Australia Sea, where that Appalachian Plain may have gone to. I mean, this is in a pretty well-traveled area, so it's perfectly plausible a boat came along, and the fleet of the Stannis' fleet. There's still remnants of the fleet floating around. So this was not, to me, it's just like the author intervening to rescue a character that he wanted to keep around for a while.
But it is interesting how he himself is wondering, like, why am I still alive when all these other lords and knights are dead? And he kind of sees like a religious point of view with Davos himself. He's like, maybe I've been kept for this purpose.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of like stories along those lines or theories along those lines. It's hard to kind of run with it, but it's very interesting to think about.
He's not Azor Ahai.
Certainly.
I mean, everyone predicts what Azor Ahai. Like in every situation, because it's like he's born amongst salt,
reborn with salt and smoke.
Here, but okay. So he's just hallucinating here when he thinks the Seven is talking to him, right? I would say. I mean, the Seven seem to be like the weakest of the. Like, there's not even people who are in their support don't have powers as far as we've seen, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether any of the gods are actually, real and manifesting powers, or whether they're followers.
Yeah. Well, you can only judge it by followers.
Magic,
but if your followers don't even have powers, then you're pretty weak.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. I'm saying, right. I'm saying, like if Mel's just a sorceress rather than, R'hllor giving her power or whatever. But yeah, certainly there's been no indication that the Seven have ever done anything for anyone.
I have a question, and this was when I first read the first couple of books. I had I come from a tradition where I just wasn't really interested in fantasy, and I had a theory, especially since I knew George R.R. Martin I always thought of him as a science fiction writer, that this is actually science fiction. That this is not an alternative Earth, but this is like a planet somewhere where like humans crashed, and sort of the remnants, and there were the native people of the planet, and so all of this actually has a natural explanation. There's no magic. Is there any fan theory about that, or just do all the happenings in the books say no? This is an actual fantasy tale.
Well, we speculated ourselves jokingly. I mean, George has a whole science fiction universe he created, which we call the Georgeverse. So, I mean, this could be a planet in that place. The others could be something created by Haviland Tuff or some character. But, I mean, there seems to be magic within this world. Doesn't mean it's not both science fiction and magic. It could be within that universe, and there could be magic on this particular planet. But
yeah, are you suggesting that it's sort of like ultra high tech, like sort of like the Lord of Light book, or
like everything has a technical explanation?
When I read the first couple of books where, I mean, people weren't coming back from the dead and things like that, which, but I just started speculating to myself that, like, well, it could be. It turns out that, the Valar were, the original Earth colonists, and there was a disaster and civilization collapsed.
Well, there is this civilization that existed before the Valyrians that is interested in this build thing everywhere. So if you want somebody from outside the planet, then that'd be them. If they came in from the skies and did that. Yeah. But I don't think it has to be in his world. I mean, he could retcon if he wanted to, but it's not. So
there's not going to be a Star Trek crossover in the last book.
Well, I think Isaac Asimov, some people said he made a mistake by combining all his works into one world. So you have to do it properly. You can't just throw it together.
Well, I also, and one of the reasons I'm in awe of George R. R. Martin is that he never seems to do anything based upon the toys. This is not driven by merchandising. This is an actual authentic work of literature as opposed to the Lucasverse. Which
is funny because it was so easy once it started to become the TV show became a reality. It was like, you know what, the marketing opportunities here are insane. Every house has a motto and a logo. You can just slap every single one of those can go on a mug or a keychain or a whatever.
Well, they've done that. There's nothing necessarily wrong with it. I mean, like
nothing at all.
Look at the board game. I mean, like they've managed to make a good board game out of it because they put good effort into it.
I agree.
We all enjoyed it. It wasn't just thrown. They could have just made like Risk and this is the Game of Thrones version of Risk.
Yeah, that would have been lame. I'm glad they did a good job of it.
There's no character. I mean, again, if in book 7, a cute robot and a small furry, sidekick show up, okay, that's it. I'm gone. But
well, they may show up, but they'll be corpses.
And then of course, I mean, to me, the central one, my shock. I mean, you guys sound like much younger folks. I'm in my 50s, but I am so used to the world of where the protagonist lives. and survives.
Yeah.
Okay, he's in the dungeon and he's about to be slaughtered, but here comes the eagles. Whatever. I'm so used to the Eagles verse that killing Ned Stark was a transformational moment in me, and I realized, oh my God, here's an author who is actually willing to do this. And then the Red Wedding. And I remember, reading the Red Wedding. My wife and I, we try to read books together at the same time so we can talk about it, And I was the first to read The Red Wedding, and I was so disturbed by that I hid the book. And she said, "Where is it? I want to catch up to where you are." I said, "No, you don't. You don't want to do this." And we didn't have an argument. We had a long discussion where I said, "You do not want to find out what happens in this chapter," which of course made her much more interested in what happened in this chapter. And then she read it, and at that point, I really would have been afraid for George R. R. Martin's life if he had been in the room, and my wife had. A gentle, sweet wife had hands on him.
Locked up all the crossbows after that.
Yeah, and of course, I was fascinated by watching all those videos on TV. And I'm sure you discussed it before of people watching the Red Wedding, mixed communities where some people had read the books and some people hadn't, and even the ones who'd been prepped by seeing Ned Stark die, going like, no, you can't possibly. Okay, you can kill the older, hero, but there's no way you're going to kill the young hero, right?
Oh, well, I guess you are going to do that, sort of.
But given all that, I mean, yes, that is true, and we all accept it. But what we've kind of come to, where the community has come to recently, the last couple of years, is when you look at it. I mean, like, yeah, he kills characters, but certain characters like Ned, it's almost like he set them up to die from the start to give you the illusion that he'll kill characters. But there's quite a few characters there that are not going to die at least till the end.
Yeah, they have
like,
plot
at the end, anything can happen at the end. But like Dany, Bran, Arya, like there's all these characters. No, they're not really going to die till the end. They might die at the end. But
I agree with that.
Well, I guess
there's
I disagree.
handful of them.
You're obviously much more experienced fans and know a lot more, but I disagree. I guess I'm saying that to somebody of my generation, maybe mass death is more familiar to you, but
it's definitely a step forward from what it was before. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I just I don't know about that. I think that might be sort of reading backwards, because let me just give an example. When I'm old enough to have read Ender's Game, the story. I mean, the short story, the very first time it was published in a magazine, and going like, wow, what a powerful story. And then the guy pads it out to a book. And I really use the term pad out if you compare the story to the book, with a lot of extraneous stuff that wasn't needed. And now he's on his, like, I don't know, 9th book, and it turns out that Bean was manipulating Ender. So I call it contractual obligation literature, where you're just churning them out, and you have to keep coming up with new ridiculous twists. I never get that feeling with George R. R. Martin. I mean, again, a lesser author would have said, okay, Ned will then, go to the Black Watch, and then he'll do this. I mean, there could have been. I mean, I'm sure that in the fan literature, there's, alternative versions of all of these things. But I give George R. R. Martin the highest praise as an author for making those choices.
Well, I think creating the illusion that any character can die is just as good as doing it. I mean, that's what you need to do. Is do it. Yeah. And the second thing is, if you looked at history, and if you looked at like Julius Caesar up to the point that he died, you'd think that like, oh, he had plot armor, because like a lot of famous people he got through like 10 different situations. You'd think, oh, he was dead, he was going to be out of it, and somehow he got out of it till that end. So people do get through the crazy things.
He qualifies as a lucky commander, I suppose. Good and lucky. Both.
He thought of himself as directly descended from the goddess Venus, and he always said, I'm luck. He literally worshipped luck. Because but that's a problem. Again, if you always rely on your luck. Assassinated. He dismissed his bodyguard because I guess he figured he was just lucky. So Tywin, I think, again, suffered from this problem of like he was so smart that he made a couple of miscalculations, including that an enemy that he didn't know about, the spider.
But both and Littlefinger as well, he misjudges as well. I mean, he thinks he's so like he's good at seeing the known threat, but these kind of like side players are just beyond him. He doesn't think that they would be a threat to him.
Yeah, he underestimated it, both. Like he certainly was aware that those guys aren't fully to be trusted, but he definitely underestimates how the breadth of their ability to impact things. Littlefinger Cersei thinks of Littlefinger as completely harmless still, which is really just wow. Yeah. And so many other people just denigrate his ability because they think of him as a coin counter. And the same with Varys. They just look down on him because he's a eunuch, and that's actually an interesting theme of the Song of Ice and Fire in general, is people manipulating or working with other people's perceptions of them and how to handle that. Like Tyrion, this is a very early concept. When Tyrion tells Jon, own the fact that you're a bastard. Don't let anyone hurt you with it. And Varys does the same. Varys is a perfect example of that. He totally plays up the fact that he's a eunuch. He doesn't want anyone to forget that he's like effeminate. He just goes out of his way to make sure people think of him as personally unthreatening. Even if he kind of grosses people out, that works, because grossing people out or making people uncomfortable isn't the same as that's not threatening. It's just kind of uncomfortable. And
and in politics and war, being underestimated is a gift.
Yeah, Varys is a master of that. Varys and Littlefinger are the two, in terms of personal propaganda, in terms of the propaganda of I'm not as dangerous as you think I am. Those two, that's their big standout, I think. Among so many other things they do well.
Now, for this particular chapter, is anything else been to comment on, or are we looking good?
Let's see. It's an interesting chapter because he does so much. It's so much inside his own head. And I love the moment at the end where he has this decision where he should, who do I say I am? And he realizes that not only are these Lysine galleys, so saying Stannis is the right thing to do anyway, but he kind of realizes
I would have said it no matter.
Yeah,
I agree. It just worked out for him. Maybe he's more lucky.
Yeah, I'm actually not sure. Like that before I had done the reread, that's always the idea I had that, or that's sort of the way I thought about it, was that he had sort of come to the decision to say Stannis, and that's what was going to happen. But rereading it was interesting that he was like, "Oh, what kind of ship is this? Should I?" And then it's like, it's Lysine. I'm not sure. I think maybe if it had been one of Joffrey's ships, he might have gone the other way.
Yeah, here's the line. I got it right in front. The galley might be Joffrey's, he realized suddenly. If he spoke the wrong name now, she would abandon him to his fate. But no, her hull was striped. She was Lysine. So yeah, it was just a flash of insight and confusion. And then he realized it was all good. So I don't know if he really had enough time to think about it one way or the other.
Yeah, that's true.
Especially given his brain working at low capacity without food.
Well, there was one crazy theory I wanted to mention, though. This is not really related to the chapter, but it's mentioned a few times. The Spears of the Merling King is what that place is called. Had you guys heard about the Merling theory?
I have.
No.
You have or you haven't?
No. I haven't heard any theories. Yeah. Remember,
Well, the Merling King is along the crazy crackback ones. Like, it's just I don't even know the full details, but it's supposed to be like there's like these Merling guys going around and manipulating things. Like Illyrio and Varys are supposed to be them or something.
Yeah, the theory got a little bit more credibility with the World of Ice and Fire because George alludes to the Maesters / George allude to ancient sea races that lived in the sea, and there's a couple different, the legends have kind of come up in a variety of places around the world, not just in Westeros. So it's still pretty far-fetched, but it's possible that such a thing is real, but I doubt it's going to be real in terms of Song of Ice and Fire proper. It's probably part of the mythos would be fine.
I agree. It's not going to have an effect. It's just interesting that he just keeps saying Merling all the time. He just likes the name.
Yeah.
There's like Littlefinger's ship is like the Merling King, and he just likes the imagery of Merlings for some reason. But, which is why would Littlefinger choose the Merling King to be his ship? Isn't that supposed to be unlucky? Like that's odd. The ship he takes to go to the Eyrie, which he could easily sink, is called the Merling King. So
I think we're getting Babylon 5 here, that there's a mysterious race that's behind everything. General conspiracy.
Okay, well, I think that's all I have for the chapter. So I want to thank all of you, for like David in particular, for coming for the interview, and Aziz and Michael for returning.
Yeah, thanks.
The podcast. Dave, is there like a website or Twitter or anything you'd like to share, or I don't know if you have something?
Just nothing to do with fandom. I'm just a teacher. So.
What is your? Since I missed the first part of the call. What is your area of expertise?
Yeah, I'm a professor at Texas Tech University and dean of the College of Media and Communication, and I teach my own area, and I write about and teach is political communication. So
very good.
I entered the world of Ice and Fire by awesome literature, but also just fascinated by case studies and examples and the sort of choices people make about political persuasion. And just it's a great textbook for talking about politics and persuasion.
Have you actually tried to incorporate it into your classes at all? Have you brought it up as a...
I find that especially college students, not a lot of college students subscribe to HBO. I mean, it's not as... Yeah. I have not found you got to be careful. I mean, it's one thing when you teach is, when you make a cultural allusion, not only you got to remember how old you are, the kids, these kids today, I find I'm saying that more and often in life, may not have a connection to the culture that you're speaking of. But you also have to make allusions that they've heard of. So I just found that it hasn't penetrated college campuses as much as it has slightly older, like people working in their 20s and up. So one day, I think 10 years from now, I'll be able to teach politics and political communication Westeros course.
My mother is a university professor also, and she's read the series and watched it. Well, she doesn't watch it; she's only read it because it's too violent visually. But so it's gotten into our school. Okay.
Hi. He's a professor at I think Mary Washington University, and he created Mythgard University online, where he and other people teach real courses in Tolkien. I mean, magicalism in Tolkien, learning Elvish 101, and people pay money for a degree. And I just thought that was, now of course the languages help a lot there, and Tolkien was a master of that. Obviously.
Well, they've developed Dothraki though. I mean, for the show they developed, and they have a course for it now. They sent us.
Yeah, I was there when people started speaking Klingon for the first time. I thought that was pretty strange, but there you go.
So we'll have to think about that after we finish our latest writings we're doing right now. Maybe we'll do a little tour.
That's what we'll all be in much later down the line.
Let's teach a course down in the year too. Westeros 101.
Well, the more people who it's interesting that you refer to it as literature, because I was just having a debate with somebody about that the other day about whether it's literature or not. And there's a lot of people that I think fantasy is starting to get accepted. It had like a hurdle to get over because people just think it's childish or whatever, or just too not realistic. But that's just silly to me because, most great literature is completely made up anyway. So. Well, I mean,
I don't know.
Just going. You know what I mean? Like,
and you just logged on. I think a little later. I said when my just at the very beginning, I was saying that I'm anti-fantasy. I don't like fantasy. I don't enjoy it as a genre at all. I think it is silly. But there's only two exceptions on my non-fantasy interest, and that is Tolkien, who was creating a historical epic that had major fantasy elements, and then me discovering World of Ice and Fire, where again, I feel it's a historical epic with fantasy elements rather than a fantasy with some historical tidbits thrown in.
I agree. I definitely agree with that, and I think that to add to your point, I kind of enjoy fantasy. Yeah, basically. I like some other new stuff, but not much of it, and it always, even when it's good, it's just still not. It's just not as good.
Actually, that's a very interesting point because Hollywood is famous for something gets to be popular and then 50 other people do bad versions of it.
Yeah,
it's interesting to me that, and I read some discussion. I don't know, it was Entertainment Weekly or whatever about that. Hollywood said, well, okay, so where are the other great properties out there for historical fantasy mythos? And there are none. I mean, there's nobody has created this kind of a detailed, dark, realistic universe out there to that you can build a world in. That's why the spin-off, I mean, the imitation shows are like Vikings or Tudors are actually drawn from historical epics. They're not drawn from somebody else's fantasy epic.
Yeah, speaking of, there's that Marco Polo show that just started today, which apparently is visually awesome, but I've heard that the plot and dialogue are pretty weak. So, but still, I like the idea. I like that it's another historical epic.
Visually, it looks really nice. Yeah.
Yeah. So hopefully, it's not as bad in that regard as it sounds, because I want to like it.
Yeah, I'd like it to be good.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna wrap us up though. Cool. Thanks again, guys. It's great.
Thanks very much.
Yeah. And thank you everyone for listening out there.
Cool.
It was good.
Thanks very much. That was good.
All right. I'll see y'all.
Yeah. I'll talk to you guys later.